Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome. How are you? Good. Welcome you all that are here, and as well as the online audience. And it brings a smile to my face, even though it's actually a sad topic. But we're here to talk about fear and anxiety and insecurity and all the other synonyms, which I hope nobody here ever has to experience, but unfortunately, or fortunately, it's part of life, part of the realities of life, cycles of life. We have our moments of joy, and we have our moments of fear. And often, in most people's lives, it's usually more fear-related and anxiety-related experiences than the other way around. As usual, I like to choose a topic that either other people don't speak about, because some of these internal psychological challenges that we all have, part of the challenge is, besides the actual issue itself, is often the isolation we feel and the loneliness we feel all alone in our particular predicament. So when it comes to things like fear, last week we spoke about passion and the lack of passion, but things like fear or anxiety or anything that's related to that, in the broad sense of the word, I mentioned insecurity. These are, in addition to the actual so-called symptoms and parameters of the actual experience, there's also the isolation we feel all alone in our own particular fear, especially when it comes to fear, because that's, by definition, that's what a fearful experience is. You're afraid, as we'll talk about in more detail. And part of that fear is also talking about it and exposing yourself, or pride, or the other reasons that we're afraid is that causes us to isolate ourselves even further, which only amplifies the reason and the need to talk about topics like this, because they are real. They can be very paralyzing. They can be extremely debilitating. Many people who are very accomplished and have all the skills and are wise and maybe even affluent, when fear strikes, we all know that it can undermine our very essence, our very confidence, and everything that keeps us going. And especially when it's a acute or extreme type of anxiety. So it's a topic that deserves to be spoken about, because, as we shall see, it impacts and affects us much more than we even know. And I'll address that in more detail. But before we get into the topic, I did want to say that some of you know Golda Malka, who sits in the front here, so I want to give her a mazel tov and dedicate the class to her, because she got engaged just 2 days ago. Tonight's her engagement party in Brooklyn, so we'll celebrate here. So those of you who know her, so that's good news. Velvel, right? So we say mazel tov to Golda Malka. Any other mazel tovs I should mention? Mazel tov to Velvel's happy birthday, and a happy birthday to Diane, the bubble bath lady. Yeah, it's an inside joke. And I want to, Rachel, happy birthday to you. I don't want to omit anybody. These are the people I know about. So if anybody has any particular celebration, feel free to mention it, and I'll be happy to honor it as well. And we should only celebrate good occasions together. And let's see this class as is an honor, a merit of all people that are celebrating this week, and so on. So now we got the niceties taken care of. We'll deal with the more raw elements of life. So the reason I chose to speak about this topic this evening is because it relates to the theme of this week's Torah portion. And as you know, so those of you that have been here know that my primary focus, is to try to so-called decipher the Torah portion and make it personally and psychologically and emotionally relevant to our lives. Judaism in general, especially Orthodox Judaism, traditional Judaism, observant Judaism, whatever you want to call it, like religion in general, especially in this country, but really all over the world, has gotten a pretty bad rap. And this is even sadder, is that it deserves that rap. Let's put it that way. And that rap is part of the stereotype that religion is not really relevant to a person in the contemporary world. Cosmopolitan, thinking person, religion seems to be either very archaic or fanatic and extreme. And once that's called the Enlightenment unleashed the battle of science and reason against faith and religion and God, many people either don't really understand the role religion plays, and for many actually they feel it has a destructive role. Just read some of the radical atheists that are bestsellers in the last few years, whether it's Harris or Hitchens' God is Not Great, or The God Delusion by Dawkins, and the list goes on. Disproportionate amount of Jews that are radical atheists, for whatever reason. And you see the backlash against things that are religious. And it doesn't help when you see Muslim fundamentalism spreading and attacking our freedoms and so on. It reminds us of all the religious fanatics throughout history, including the Christian fanatics, the Crusades, Inquisition, and others that wreaked terror upon the world in the name of God. So there are many, many reasons that there would be a backlash for any thinking person who's dedicated to human rights and so on, to this type of religion. And then for many who grew up in traditional homes, much of the Judaism often is very, maybe beautiful, but often programmed. What I mean by that is, we have in the prayer we say in the Shemona Esrei, in the Amidah prayer that's said 3 times a day, there's an expression, Elokeinu v'Elokei Aviseinu. It means my God and the God of my parents. And the question is asked, the Baal Shem Tov asked this question, the order should be reversed. First, God is the God of your parents before He becomes your God. And the answer is a beautiful one, that the purpose and the real meaning of God is when it's integrated and you own it and it becomes yours, not just something that was passed on to you by your parents through education or programming or training and conditioning. So though all of us begin our lives obviously under the influence of those around us, starting with our parents and educators, but the real purpose of a real relationship with God is that it becomes something personal and internalized, that it's yours, you own it. And that's not something you see very common. So when we read the Torah, and the Torah is read every week in the synagogues, the real question is, why does this matter to us? Why should we care about something that happened thousands of years ago in a different part of the world, in Egypt, specifically these week's chapters, and as I said, thousands of years ago? I mean, so many things have happened since then. We have our own problems today. So good, they may find some inspiration, but if you ask anyone that is a very devout Jew who goes to synagogue and listens to the Torah reading and to every precise word and pores over the commentaries, and I know this because I grew up in that environment, the question is, why is it so relevant? And what's the obsession with every letter and every detail? There's no question the Bible offers us beautiful lessons, and much of civilized ideas, many of them come from the Bible, 10 Commandments and so on. And books like Thomas Cahill's Gift of the Jews, The Gifts of the Jews, and other books like that demonstrated the gift that the Jews brought to civilization. But at the same time, there's so many episodes and stories that don't seem to really have relevance to us today. So to go back to why I'm saying this is because the focus that I've dedicated and why I do this in the first place is to bring it alive in a relevant way. So though as a skeptic myself I had these questions, but at some point I came to discover that there is a brilliance and there is a real profound relevant message, spiritual message within all these teachings. But you have to get beyond the surface and beyond the technical and mechanical elements of it to appreciate that depth. So here, just to begin, this week's chapter begins. It's the 3rd chapter in the book of Exodus, the 2nd book of the Torah. So it begins, it says like this, that God speaks to Moses, Boy Pare, come to Pharaoh. I'm translating from the Hebrew. Come to Pharaoh. So immediately the question jumps out, what's this come to Pharaoh? When you tell somebody, you would say go to Pharaoh. There's an expression in Hebrew, lech, to go to. And you see that expression used many, many times where God says to Moses, go to Pharaoh, or go to Egypt, or go here, or go there. Come to Pharaoh implies that I'm there, and I'm asking you to come with me. So the Zohar which is the classic work of Kabbalistic thought, the Kabbalah, a book authored close to 2,000 years ago, stops and asks this question: what does the meaning come to Pharaoh? And the Zohar answers a fascinating answer, and hence the theme of this evening, fear. It says that Moses had already encountered Pharaoh several times. And if you read the previous portions, after God chose Moses to lead the Jews out of Egypt, of course the first step was to confront Pharaoh and demand that he do so. And Pharaoh would not agree. He said, I don't know your God. I don't have a God. I control the destiny of the people here. And there's the classic story, the famous story of the plagues. And Moses keeps returning to Pharaoh time and again. So the Zohar says the following, that at this point, this was already now, he had met Pharaoh at least 7-8 times. 7 different appointments with him. That it says that Moses, at this point, said to God, I'm afraid to go. Because now I'm already dealing with a Pharaoh and I see what he's really about. Moses was afraid of the evil, the core evil, the essential evil of, as the Zohar puts it, of this great serpent. Pharaoh was not a simple person. He was a man with great power, almost like a demon-like power. Some people, just to make it more contemporary, associate it even with a person like Hitler. When you watch some of the films of his talks and how he hypnotized a nation, you see a certain power. There's no question that man had power. In the way he spoke, in his even his radicalism, his passion, misplaced and most destructive, obscene type, but he captured the audiences. You have to just, I mean, it's amazing to see. And we're talking about 100 million Germans. Not all were fanatics. Not all were anti-Semites per se. Not all were ready to do what he was going to do, but in some way he captured them. So we're not trying to necessarily turn this into mystical, but he definitely had some power. You know, certain people have powers, and God forbid if they use them the wrong way, it can be extremely destructive. If they use them the right way, then obviously they can change the world in a positive way. So Pharaoh had power. He was not a simple man. The Zohar emphasizes his mystical power, because power comes from energy. When a human being has a lot of great power, regardless of how it's used, it has and it can, as I said, either build or can destroy. So at this point, Moses had, so to speak, entered, as the Zohar puts, all the layers of Pharaoh, and now he already saw what Pharaoh's inner power was. So he said to God, "I'm afraid to go." And the expression is he actually trembled. Great Moses, man of God, chosen by God, and man who, as we know, is absolutely fearless. You see it throughout the entire Torah, but he was afraid. We'll discuss why soon. So the Zohar says that's why in this case God said to him, Boy al pare, I'm not sending you to him. I'm not telling you go. I say come with me. I'm with you. And together, with my power, you'll be able to overcome and actually overpower him. And that's exactly what happens. Moses proceeds. And the story unfolds in this week's chapter. It's in this chapter that finally Moses prevails, of course with a little help of the plague of the firstborn, and Pharaoh was a firstborn, that finally Pharaoh agrees and relents and allows the people to leave. So Moses did prevail. But it became first with fear. It didn't come easily. There was a price to pay. So it's interesting to analyze on its own what was Moses afraid of. And what did God really answer that alleviated Moses' fears, and he was willing and able to enter into this inner sanctum of evil. And of course, most importantly, what it means to us in our lives today, and how we can learn lessons from it and understand how to overcome or deal with the fears that each of us has to struggle with. So this is the point of departure. But to do this effectively, what I would like to do is go back to the topic of fear itself. As I said, the things that are most difficult to dissect, the most difficult, the difficult topics to dissect their anatomy are things that are invisible. You know, it's one thing if you have an object or an experience that you can empirically analyze and break down and dissect, then you can figure something out here. But when it comes to forces that we cannot touch, and we can't see, and we can't taste, touch, or smell, or hear in any tangible way, it becomes increasingly difficult. How do you know what it looks like? What does fear look like? I mean, obviously you could ask the same question about positive feelings like love or joy. They also are invisible. But in a strange way, as I mentioned earlier, positive experiences, because they make us feel good about ourselves, and they lift us up and they give us confidence, it's easier to analyze. Things that make us shrink and cause us to retreat, we don't want to even look at, because it's like, that itself, as I said before, you fear the fear itself, to paraphrase FDR. So then it becomes more difficult because we don't even want to see joy. We cannot see it, but we see its effects on us. And we want to see its effects. It's actually something you embrace. Joy, you want to celebrate, you invite friends, whether it's a wedding, a bar mitzvah, a birthday, anything, a joyous occasion is a uplifting, you want to share it, and so on. Love, similarly, is something invisible, but its consequences, its symptoms, and impact on us is something we embrace. So love we would associate with intimacy, warmth, companionship, depending what type of love, obviously. But love is a form of closeness. Someone cares about you, affection, you care about them, etc., etc. But when we talk about fear, even though there are symptoms, and we can discuss them, we will, but it's much more complicated because nobody wants to look at it. Who wants to see what your fear looks like? It may be much, that itself is frightening. So how in general do we then look at something that is invisible? So I've discussed several times here, using a scientific example. In science there is, we call it interpolation and extrapolation. To extrapolate, there's interpolate. Interpolation is when you're able to directly observe and analyze any given phenomenon. Extrapolation is the tool used when you have no direct access. So you have to extrapolate. It's a form of process of elimination or seeing the effects of something. A simple example would be, no human being has ever seen, or in any sensory form, experienced subatomic particles. They're just simply impossible they're too small to be seen, and they'll never be seen because they're just outside of that range. No instrument will ever be able to relate to them. And yet, we are very aware of them. Not only aware of them, most of the technologies that have made our lives so comfortable and easy are based on subatomic quantum mechanics, the microchip, cellular technology. And the question is, how are we able to manipulate and take advantage of forces that we have no way of directly observing? And the answer is through extrapolation. For example, if you speed up in high accelerated speeds the particles in nuclear particles, subatomic particles, or you superheat them, they release certain type of energy. So we don't see them directly, but we see their impact. So just to use an example, and the same thing is you can use it psychologically, and I'll get there in a moment, with the unconscious. No one can see the unconscious. No one can ever witness the unconscious. That's why it's called unconscious. Unconscious. Conscious things we can relate to, unconscious things we can't. And yet we know it's there, whatever name you want to give it. Long before Freud, especially in Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah, there's much talk about the unconscious. So the unconscious is there. We know it because we see its effect on us, even though we don't see it itself. Like most of us do not remember what happened when you were 2 years old in your life. You may have a glimpse of something when you were 2 or 3, maybe you want one image, but in any enduring way, we don't have memories of that age, especially younger than that, 1 year old, in your mother's womb. And yet we know today that experiences then, especially if they're traumatic or in any way intense, can have profound impact the rest of your life. So it's somewhere embedded, let's call it in our unconscious memory, though you may not ever see the experience or remember it, but you see its impact on you. Why some of us have, for example, uncontrollable rage, or other emotional reactions to things. So you see the symptom, and the symptom tells you there must be some root for this, because it didn't just come out of nowhere. If you explore it, you may discover that you grew up in a home where rage was an acceptable, quote-unquote, tool, way of coping. It's not acceptable, but you grew up with it. So now you may not even remember the rage of your parents, a father or mother, but you can see it in your own life. Sometimes you do remember. The point is that there are forces inside of us, and most of them that are absolutely invisible, yet their impact is not invisible at all. They're very visible. It shapes how you behave right now. Why two people who have exactly the same experience will have different reaction? It's not just they're wired differently. That's one part of it. It's also different attitudes, different nurture nature, different ways they were nurtured, different attitudes they picked up. So how do you explore the unconscious? You go to therapy. So many therapists know what they're doing, many don't. That's another story, how you find out the right one. Sometimes through trial and error and through a few, some let's call it the bills that you have to pay until you find out. That's part of the process. So a good therapist, someone who's trained, who's able to relate to a person on a deeper level, not just on externals. Externals you don't need a therapist for. You don't need anyone to help you. You can know yourself how you behave on a daily basis. You want to get to the root. You want to get this to the causes instead of the symptoms. So what is done for someone who is able to look at the unconscious, so to speak, through experience. Sometimes this therapist is someone who has gone through it themselves, so they're able to identify. But it's usually a combination of personal identification, a certain sensitivity and empathy to the human condition, and of course experience that allows you to extrapolate. What's extrapolate mean? So here's an example I often use. I don't even remember where I came up with it, but it always struck me as a good example for this. That imagine you have an imaginary wall, a wall, and it's completely shrouded in darkness. You can't see the wall. So you have no idea what it looks like, what shape it's in, whether it's a straight wall, whether it's a crooked wall, whether it's a jagged wall. And there's no light shining in it, so it's completely dark. And you cannot go over and touch it. What other way is it possible for you to figure out what this wall looks like? And you can't turn on a light, and you can't touch it. So initially, ostensibly, it seems like that's it. Okay, it's too bad. You can't do anything about that. It's not the case. Here's an option. You take a ball, say a rubber ball, and you bounce it on the wall. And it bounces back at you. So if it bounces back straight, you know that the wall is straight. If you keep bouncing the ball at different parts of the wall, and it bounces back in different directions, you can extrapolate, not to direct, not interpolate, but extrapolate. You can figure out what this wall is like, almost as if you saw it. You need to bounce the ball many times, and you need to see how it bounces back. If it bounces back to the right, you know there must be a right indentation. To the left, you keep bouncing until you can map out the wall indirectly. This is what some scans actually do. CAT scans and other scans that go internally into even a physical body, they don't necessarily see what's going on. They see what blocks there are. In a way, it's almost like how you find out there's an infection. You don't see the infection. You see the white blood cells accumulating to fight the infection, which is also a form of extrapolation. It's not a direct observation. It's through indirect. But it's equally powerful and compelling and convincing. So, just like if you go, God forbid, to a doctor and you have a pain, let's say, in your arm, and you start touching, the doctor starts touching, it says it hurt here, until you suddenly get to the point where there's a raw nerve, and you say it hurts. So the doctor can't see the nerve, but by touching and feeling, seeing the area, experienced eye can learn what the problem may be. The same thing is in a conversation. And I speak from my own experience. You talk to someone about something, about their life, and they share with you challenges they have, or problems they have, or fears that they may have. And you do the same thing. It's not physical touch, it's psychological. And you try to explore different areas, we call the usual suspects, until you get to the unusual suspects, and different situations, and you see how a person reacts. I mean, this happened, and I'm of course saying this in a sensitive way. It's not, God forbid, to manipulate or to pry or be curious if someone really wants your assistance. So you ask, and you of course with permission ask them questions, and you suddenly see that when you start talking about, let's say, their mother, the person doesn't want to talk, or is so glib and says, no, there's nothing there, no problem at all, let's move on. So these are signs that a person, that it's like a raw nerve. Now that doesn't mean that you have to assault in any way, violate or assault a person's boundaries. If a person is very sensitive to something, so maybe you have to leave it alone. But you know there's something buried there. And the goal, of course, in a sensitive way, in a respectful way, is to help a person slowly ease them to that place where they can look at it a little more, and they can maybe understand their own life in a different way. So this is the method of how we extrapolate, in psychologically speaking, to understand ourselves. Now this is, of course, extremely difficult to do with yourself, because we're subjective, and we're not going to go to a place. It's just like you're not going to touch yourself in a place which is most hurtful. Someone else may, because they don't feel the pain. So because of our subjectivity, it's very, very difficult, I would say almost impossible actually, to really extrapolate and understand your own unconscious through your own behavior. You could, if you have the courage and if you have your own willpower. Of course, you see areas that you refuse to address in your life. You see your resistance. From the resistance, you know there's something there. But it's often much easier and helpful when you have a good friend, someone you can trust, obviously, that has that objectivity that helps. That just as an aside. So there is a method, there is a way of actually seeing the invisible in that sense. So with this introduction, then when you look at fear, we could, especially when you're not in the situation, directly in that situation, for example, when a ship is caught at sea in a storm, it's very difficult to then start analyzing and starting to dissect and try to figure out where the weakness of the ship is. Well, whereas in good weather, or before the ship goes out to sail, goes out from the port, that's when you really want to check it up. So once a person is in a debilitating or difficult situation emotionally, it's of course increasingly difficult to dissect at that point. It's possible, but it's harder. It's usually easier to do it when things are more peaceful and when you can anticipate, because usually in a moment of shock or trauma or any type of very serious emotional reaction to something, anxiety attack or something, it's very difficult to you can stabilize it and try to help somebody feel at peace or calm, but it's very difficult to right there and then start intervening. It's like when a person, God forbid, is bleeding, you have to stop the bleeding before you can perform surgery. Like that guy, what I just read this joke about, I don't know if it's a joke or not. So a doctor, some very famous surgeon who goes to bring his automobile to an auto mechanic. And they get into this conversation, and the mechanic says to him, let me ask you something, doctor. You perform surgery. How much do you get paid an hour? So, surgery is say, thousands of dollars an hour. Who even knows? They don't even tell you. Attorneys at least tell you. The doctors, they don't tell you. You get it later with insurance or whatever. And the auto mechanic says, I don't understand why that is. I do the same thing you do. I also perform surgery, and I fix them a car, your automobile, and I get $20 an hour, $30 an hour, $50 an hour, $75, whatever the prices are. And why is it that you're doing the same type of thing and you're getting so much more? So the doctor responded, well, try fixing the car while traveling at 90 miles an hour. So there's once a person is in a position where they're active, it's very difficult to go ahead and start tampering with the emotional makeup of a person. So with all these qualifications, so then how do we analyze fear? So this chapter here, and the story with Moses, can help us do this in a more dispassionate way, because here we can discuss it academically. This is what we can call, in psychological terms, cognitive, a positive form of cognitive dissonance. What does that mean? It's like what they call the cognitive life raft. Sometimes when you can't address a topic because it's so raw and tender and difficult, you can discuss it academically as if it's happening with somebody else. And that makes it easier to talk about, even though we're really talking about you. Like that guy that came to the Rebbe Marash and said, I have a friend who did a terrible thing, he's ashamed to come to you. So he sent me to ask what he can do about it. So the Rebbe responded to him, why did he have to expose himself to you? He could have come to me and say, I have a friend, which is of course the situation. So the fact is there are times in a healthy way, and this is absolutely a good gimmick, that if you yourself can't address something, it's always good, at least if you can't address it directly, to go to somebody that you trust and say, it's not, I have a friend. Now a trained person will pretty much pick it up pretty quickly, but at least you can get away thinking that nobody knows, and that way you can get some advice, because it's not about you, it's about somebody else, so to speak, academically. So there is an advantage to discuss fear in a detached way, but with a critical qualification, that obviously to stay theoretical and academic and not apply it to real situation is obviously not the goal. But it helps because it's in a way looking at something first in a dispassionate, more objective way, and then applying it to the more subjective and challenging situation. So that being said, so what exactly then, or how can we extrapolate and identify fear? So the first thing, let's break it down into two types of fears. There are conscious and unconscious fears. Conscious fears are ones that you simply put, you are aware of. Simple as that. You're walking down a street at night and you feel someone's following you, God forbid. You sense danger. It's a conscious fear. It's a normal fear that all of us have, certain fright. Sometimes it's baseless, sometimes it's based on something. Always good to err on the side of caution. We have many physical fears. Today the people have fears that are, I'm not even getting now whether they're legitimate or not, but they're conscious in the sense you're aware of it. Some people fear flying. I remember sitting there, a guy who I know very well, and I didn't know it till the time we took off, and he was terrified. I held his hand. It didn't help. My courage didn't help him, but his fear didn't affect me, so we were pretty much even. But he has the fear of flying. Where it comes from, I'm not really sure. I haven't analyzed it. I've not studied it. But it's a very tangible, concrete fear that people have. Again, I'm not going into whether these are legitimate fears or not, but they're conscious fears. Today, there's a certain climate of fear as far as, when you go with all these security checks at airports, the whole terrorism, threats. So some people aren't affected deeply, but some are very much affected by it. You see it again and again in the news. And it's created a certain climate of fear. Some people are very tangible, very concrete, conscious fear. And today, in the climate of economic climate, people have fears of uncertainty, of where we're headed. Will you going to keep your job? Will you not keep your job? How long? And what happens if, God forbid, something happens economically? And there's a lot of fears. People, foreclosures, all other types of economic unpredictability that is impacting many, many people. I'm just using these as examples of fears that you can identify. And some of them, as I said, are very legitimate. And if it's a healthy person, so what do you do? Fear, in a way, is it's like a wake-up call, which we shall soon talk about as well. And it's a way of maybe bolstering or some way preventing or preempting situation that is causing you this type of fear. Then there's the unconscious form of fear. Now this is much more complicated. As I mentioned before, unconscious fears everybody has. And most people who have them do not admit it. Not because they have too much pride or because they don't want to admit it, because they themselves don't know. You can see it sometimes in its impact. When you see, for example, an ambitious business person who's made it, very successful, wealthy, well-connected, and so on, there's no way that you could know that person's level of fear. You'd think that the person has courage because they took risk, they were able to climb the ladder, were able to compete with others. That takes courage. People who are not ambitious and courageous and fearful are not going to get themselves in a rat race and the fear of failure. But the truth is, we know psychologically that sometimes the drive in people to succeed is driven precisely because of fear. And it's a way of compensating. So the unconscious fears of a human being are one of the most complicated subjects and very, very difficult to identify. Unfortunately, often they're identifiable when something tragic happens, when a real challenge takes place. Then you suddenly see, like in all cases, when all the masks are stripped and all the layers are stripped, you suddenly see the more primal forces inside of us. For example, fear of death. In Taoism, you have the Tibetan Book of Dead. In Buddhism in general, there is the general concept that all fears come down to the fear of death. It's the fear of annihilation, the fear of the end, that you will ultimately no longer be here. Now, it's not a fear that most of us are conscious of. There are times we have a fright, we have a scare, health-wise or danger-wise and so on. But most of us would say, going through the day-to-day, you don't consciously think about death. And for the good. And yet, as I said, Buddhism especially, and there are other psychologists that say this is a fear that is beneath all fears. Some even go to the extent that say that most drives for success, ambition, why we want to make a mark on the world, why we want to memorialize ourselves, we build monuments, why the pharaohs built pyramids and other monuments, why the Greeks did the same and the Romans, was to alleviate that fear that I would disappear. That way my mark, my presence, some way lives on. And some say that most of the driving ambition in history for success, even good success, even things like inventions and discoveries, were driven by the fear of being forgotten, the fear of insignificance. So there's a whole list of fears that none of us really sense, but impacts tremendously. I'm not making an argument that what these philosophers or thinkers argue or psychologists say is correct, but definitely there are elements to those elements, and definitely there are people that it is a driving force. So it's not precisely fear of death per se, it's a fear of being insignificant, of being irrelevant. Nobody wants to be irrelevant. And some people will do things that are actually destructive to get attention, not to be irrelevant. It's a common psychological phenomenon. Teenagers and others that are crying out for help, they'll do something radical to get attention. It's a fear. It's coming from a fear. Now you think that person is just being destructive or trying to do something it's self-destructive. It's not necessarily. It could be driven by a fear that person is calling out for help. So these are just some examples, and the list goes on and on and on. And none of us here on this earth is immune to unconscious fears. I mean, conscious fears as well, but the unconscious sort, much more impact in our lives. You know, if you're walking down a frightening street, or you have a certain particular fear in a certain situation, that may be a temporary fact. You know, that comes and goes. Next morning you wake up, and the sound you thought you heard downstairs in your house was meaningless. So you forget about it. So those type of fears are not necessarily have any deeper impact. But the fears that are unconscious have profound impact. And I haven't even touched upon the biggest one of all, which is the one that touches relationships. The fear of rejection, the fear of never finding real love, the fear of being vulnerable. One of the big ones, to be vulnerable. Which means that you're open target, so to speak. Open practice, that if you allow yourself to let your defenses down, you'll be hurt. Now, in relationships, people initially, when we're younger and more naive, let's say, and you do allow yourself to fall in love, and then get hurt, or disappointed, or betrayed, or whatever other, or violated in one way or another, obviously it has a big impact. What happens is you're not ready to go there that quickly again, and this time you go with more defenses. So how can we even assess the levels of defensive mechanisms and the layers of armor that we've built up over the years to protect ourselves? You know, they say the oyster, pearls, beautiful natural pearls, which we value and enhance us and adorn us, are really basically a defense mechanism of an oyster trying to protect itself from the irritation of a piece of dust that enters its very soft, tender skin. So it secretes a fluid that so-called that gets rid of the irritation. Think of a piece of dust on your eyeball. So on the eyeball, you have to either get rid of it, and usually the tear ducts, the tears get rid of it, and the natural lubrication of the eye. But in the case of an oyster, the only protection it has is it secretes this liquid that when it hardens becomes a pearl. That's oyster pearls. You know, a porcupine has the sharpest needles. They say the underbelly of a porcupine is the softest of all skin of all animals. So often, if you want to talk about extrapolation, when you see someone that's very tough and very aggressive, very, very often, I'm not saying always, it's a result of being hurt. And they've built up sharp needles to protect themselves. Sometimes it's not even conscious. I know a person coming to this class years ago, grew up in a home in Europe, a very abusive home. Not abusive so much directly, more in absenteeism. For a child, not having parents around from youngest of age is quite abusive. However, it's not abusive in the physical sense of it, physical or emotional or sexual abuse or psychological. It's more in the deprivation of a flower getting water. A child needs water. A child needs love and nurturing like a flower needs water. And it has deep impact when you don't have that type of nurturing, because what happens to the child starts growing up feeling, I don't deserve it, and becomes very fearful. And this particular person built up such a very intelligent person, a very sensitive person, built up such defense mechanisms. I mean, it was one of the strongest I've ever seen in my life. But thank God I was trained enough to recognize it. A one of the most gentlest souls I've ever met, but built up this hard armor to protect herself from her mother and father, basically, and from the world. Now, it's not so easy. What do you do once you turn an adult? What do you do with this armor that was there to save your life in a way? So it's a whole challenge of how you melt it down. We'll talk about that as well. But it's an example of how fear suddenly creates a whole new set of tools and coping mechanisms that you would never even identify with fear. You'd think a person is aggressive, abrasive, tough, ambitious, all the different factors. And really, it's all coming down to is a frightened child that has no one to protect her or him, and doing whatever it can to protect. So it acts out, or is very hard or very difficult, and so on. Now, of course, you could say, well, there are people that I know that are difficult in my life, and they're not sensitive, and there's no gentle soul at all. There's no underbelly, like a porcupine's underbelly, or a oyster, and so on. Well, first of all, how do you know? Just because you have been at the brunt of getting anger or aggression of a human being in your life, that doesn't mean that they don't have that. It just means that you've not seen it. Maybe that person themselves have never seen their own soft side. So, as I said, this unfolds, and we'll talk about it in different ways in a moment. So these are the unconscious fears as opposed to the conscious ones. And they impact every area of our lives, and primarily, as I said, relationships. Because you see, in areas like we have to go shopping, or commuting, or even going to work, more or less there, you have ways to protect yourself in most situations. I'm not saying everybody does, and not in every situation. Obviously, at work you're almost as intimate as with people that you love, and you're there all the time. With an abrasive boss, or an abusive client, or co-workers, and so on, can be quite miserable, just like having someone in the family that way. But nevertheless, because you don't have to completely open yourself up as you would in a real relationship, a romantic or personal relationship with someone, most of us have some defense mechanism. But when it comes to a personal relationship, loving someone, finding your soulmate in this world, someone that you could live with the rest of your life, someone you trust absolutely, or would want to trust absolutely, there's no two ways about it. What are you supposed to do? If you're going to bring your defense mechanisms into it, and all your fears, and your past experiences of hurt and betrayal and so on, you'll undermine the relationship. On the other hand, if you open yourself up completely, you can get very deeply hurt. So what does one do? Okay, so the obvious answer on a very practical level is stages. Early on, you meet somebody, you date someone, you don't just open up completely. You let them in a little, you let enough, you test the water, so to speak. And trust takes time. People have to earn trust. Trust is not based on perfection. Trust is based on accountability. You start seeing people's accountability. If you're a mature person, you recognize everyone has their faults. People make their mistakes, but are they accountable? When they're accountable, you can trust someone even if they make a mistake. A mistake that many of us make is that we think that if someone's not perfect, I can't trust that person. That comes from immaturity, but also comes from being hurt usually. So you're looking for perfection. Since you were hurt once, now I want someone that's not going to hurt me. But that's not possible in love. The beauty of love is that you can be hurt anytime. But you just want to have someone that's a partner with you in life that is not going to hurt you. Or at least will be accountable if something happens. They're sensitive enough. And if there's a mistake, it could be sometimes deliberate, but they can truly have remorse. That's what you really want in a relationship. So it's something that you have to build. But can you really get rid of your true primal and psychological and unconscious fears that have built up over the years? And I know this is a big question because I deal with it, unfortunately, a lot. This is the biggest issue in relationships. It's not just about whether she squeezes the toothpaste from the middle of the tube and he doesn't. Or they have different ways, customs of how they throw out the garbage. Or other so-called big issues that couples deal with. We're talking about the emotional issues that people don't talk about. Yes, once you see people getting into a domestic battle, obviously they're going to jump on every stupid detail, but it's really, the root of it is an emotional one. It's not rooted in the technical thing. Once you lose your emotional connection with someone, then everything will irritate you. Everything, literally. How they smile and how they look and how they eat and everything. When you love someone, you overlook most things. So with the root of most difficulties is emotional, in the things that are invisible. So how do you deal with a couple who both have invisible blind spots, both have fears, and are not even trained to look at it? Well, of course, the first step is to have them acknowledge it. If they're not ready to acknowledge, if someone's not ready to acknowledge and enter into the situation saying, yes, it's possible, I don't have it all figured out, very, very difficult to help them. I would say it's impossible. So here's lesson number 1 from Moses. And it may sound almost counterintuitive and even so simplistic, but if you think about it, you'll see how unbelievable and powerful it is. Moses was not afraid to say to God, I'm afraid. That was the first thing. That's what made him so courageous. He said, I've seen Pharaoh, I've seen evil, and now I'm afraid to go. This great Moses was not ashamed to say that, and it would be forever recorded till this day. So he had the strength to be able to say that I don't know what to do. I don't know. I'm afraid. Why is that so critical? Because when you're dealing with an invisible enemy, the first thing is awareness. What the greatest enemy of our enemies is exposure, clarity. Look what happens when you shine a light under, let's say, a stone where all kinds of maggots have collected. Or you open up an infection to fresh air. What happens? All infections, all toxic environments thrive on secrecy, on enclosure, on being concealed. I'm thinking where I heard this. I think in one of the TED conference talks, I heard this woman, like a Turkish, French storyteller. She said something very interesting. These 18-minute, 17-minute talks you get online. You can check it out. I forgot her name. So she said she grew up, her mother was super rational, philosophical, and or it was the other way around, her father. And her grandmother was this superstitious Sufi from Turkey. And she said her grandmother, people would come to her for healing. Now, of course, all the rational people in the family thought this was insane. But she says, I grew up, went to college, Western schools, so I also looked at it as somewhat odd. But I have to tell you, everybody that came to my grandmother was healed. My grandmother would do, this is what she says. She would draw circles, physical circles around an infection or anything that people got, even acne or other things like that. They would draw a circle. And then within a week or two, in most cases, she got rid of the illnesses. I don't know if she went, this is how she's telling the story, so it's not my story. You can check it out in this TED conference stuff. And she asked her grandmother why. She said, because anything that doesn't have fresh air will die. A circle encloses something, so ultimately it will die. Which is true. With warts and other things, if you get rid of any type of open air, you can kill anything, because it needs fresh air. Her point was about more on a psychological level, that when we hear different cultures and through stories and through song, you can open up people to experiences that helps bring healing. But on a very basic level, medical level, for sure, infections thrive on a festering environment where it's completely enclosed and nothing fresh enters there. That's exactly what every infection, physical and definitely emotional, psychological. So the ability for a person to come, and I'll apply it to a relationship. Two people come and say, our relationship isn't working. But when we started out, we loved each other. And something is just not working, and it's getting worse and worse. So the first tendency that people have is you point fingers. It's her fault, it's his fault. Sometimes you even blame yourself, it's my fault. And you start finding all kinds of reasons. But very often, but very rarely, will you find somebody who will just simply say, is it possible at all that I have some fear that I cannot point out that is affecting me, and I can't see it, so I don't know what to do about it? Well, this is what Moses basically said to God. He said that I have a fear, and I'm acknowledging it, and I need your help. Don't underestimate the power of that first statement in dealing with real fears. Without it, we will cover up, we'll distract, and remember, when you have resistance to something, you'll find the solution elsewhere. In the healing circles, they use this story. It comes from Chelem, actually, but it's a common story used in any type of therapeutic and healing situations, where a guy's looking for his keys at night, in the dark. So a neighbor comes over and says, let me help you look for your keys. Where did you lose them? And he points 100 yards away. I lost them over there. So why are you looking here? He says, because here the light is shining. This comes from a Chelem story, but it's used, you'll see it, it's used very often. Now you think it's a little insane. Who would look for their keys 100 yards away? Why don't you look where you lost them? Because we never look where it's dark. We want to look where it's easy to look. You always want to look for a solution in the easy way, a quick fix. You don't want to go to places that are dark, complicated, and confusing. You only go there when you have no choice. And even then, it's not so easy. That's why they say in many situations, you have to hit rock bottom before you begin to heal. Why is that? Why do you have to wait till hit rock bottom? What's wrong with a few inches before rock bottom? It's also pretty bad. Because there's something weird about human beings. We do not like discomfort. And our comfort zones are extremely, extremely powerful. Greater than you'll ever imagine. And I say this about all of us, including myself. They're so powerful that we have the concept of, the known evil is better than the unknown evil. Why do we have the battered wife syndrome? People in abusive environments who are physically being hurt or in other ways being hurt, and they refuse to leave the situation. They'll find excuses. They'll say, I provoked him. It was my fault. He's really a good guy. If he stops drinking, a whole list. They'll give every list possible. What you think a normal person, the first reaction most of us have, even selfish reaction, is protection, self-protection. Survival of the species, survival of the fittest. Why would you make an excuse for somebody to hurt you? It's like a major distortion if you think about it objectively. And yet you find perfectly normal people, healthy people, who get themselves stuck in such situations. Because there's something that happens with your comfort zone, the known evil, and you start thinking something the matter with me. And if I leave this relationship, maybe I'll find someone else worse. So there's there's almost like a predictability to the evil. And this is not a fantasy or theory. This is very common, unfortunately more common than we'd like to believe. So the ability to have courage and say, I have fear, I have blind spots, and I need to get out of this situation, and I will do what it takes. Don't underestimate the power of that. And that's exactly what Moses did. And then God responds the second half. If you meet me halfway, you've told me that you're afraid, I will tell you what, I will come with you. You're not going alone. Now, but it's critical the first half, because you can't just say, listen, God, I pray to God, come with me and deal with all my fears. Try it out. Tell me how many fears will be alleviated next time you pray. It doesn't just happen, because fears are very deep. It's not like you say, okay, I have a fear, and then you pray to God, and God says, and you say to God, listen, I want you to get rid of my fear, and then everything is hunky-dory, and that's it. If that was the case, we wouldn't need all these dating sites and all the millions and billions that are being spent on therapy and on matchmaking and millionaire matchmaking and so on, because we just pray to God to get rid of our fears. I've been hurt, so what? I'll overcome it, go with God's help, and I can get into a relationship that's healthy and so on. It's easier said than done. It's nice to say, people of faith, I have faith in God, but that's not the key. The key is that God said to Moses, I'll come with you, after Moses made a major step, which was, he said, I'm afraid, and I need your help. And it was an acknowledgement that I'm ready to do what it takes. So it wasn't just as God was coming with him. Because think about it this way. Why didn't Moses simply say to God, listen, why don't you go to Pharaoh? I'll stay out, and you go to Pharaoh, you deal what you got to do. It didn't happen that way. Moses went, and it was Moses that had to speak to Pharaoh, and it was still frightening. But he now had a new strength. He discovered a deeper strength that he did not have before. His vulnerability, his ability to say, that I'm afraid and I need help, brought the real help. And suddenly a new strength emerged inside of him. And this is a very critical lesson in any fear one has to deal with. So it's not just the statement you usually hear, okay, without a God, without faith, how can we really overcome almost impossible challenges? You see people with faith. Viktor Frankl documents it in his Man in Search of Meaning, where he talks about the Holocaust, that the people that had faith, people that had that strength, were able to survive and endure the most impossible situations, whereas the people that didn't gave up. There's no question there's an element to that, but there's a deeper aspect to it, which is the effort that the person is making to reach that type of strength. Because God can give everybody strength, but you have to be ready to receive it. And it's only when you're ready to receive it that it will really have impact. So what does that mean in more practical terms? In more practical terms, it means that we have, just like we have unconscious fears, we also have unconscious strengths. And as it is in any type of situation, when you go into the boxing ring, you have heavyweights fight heavyweights, and middleweights fight middleweights. You don't want a middleweight fighting a heavyweight. So the same thing is with us. The more debilitating an emotional, psychological forces in our lives, like fear, the more you need to have something that's equivalent and as powerful. So this is the reason that we have to access those type of strengths, because without them you will never be able to overcome the depth of the fears. What often happens is that people underestimate their own fear or own insecurity, and they feel confident, and they take on a situation, or they commit to something, and then what happens at the end is that they don't really have the tools. And when the fears come back with ferocity, you're left completely lost, because you don't have an equivalent force that comes from the same deep place. So the idea of connecting to recognizing that one has fear, the second step is understanding that you also have strengths that you are not aware of. And that also takes courage to acknowledge, because most of us think, I'm ready to, I like to connect to the strengths I'm aware of. It's not easy to relate to and say I have strengths I don't even know of. But the fact is we do have such strengths. Now, you could ask, how do we know that? Well, there is an element of accepting something. I mean, there's ways to prove it. But on a very practical level, if I were to ask you here, based on the potential in your soul, the potential of your spirit, the potential of your faculties, how much of that potential, ratio-wise, have you actualized in your life? So let's say the potential is 100%. Have you actualized 1%, 5%, 10%, 50%, 80%? So any intelligent person will say, I can't really say because I don't know what my potential is. If I knew what my potential was, I could say, okay, based on what I know, I've done so much and so much. It's like if you know that the destination is, let's say, 1,000 miles away, you know that as a fact. So I've gone 10 miles, 100 miles. But if I don't know if it's 1,000 miles or it's 1,000,000 miles, I don't know the capacity, how can you state the potential? I did this non-scientific survey, which I have already shared the results with at this class. And this was a few years ago. I did this survey. I wanted to just see what the results would be. I asked around 200 people. Now this wasn't done, as I said, in any scientific way. I just chose randomly whoever I was able to access. But here were the criteria. They were people of all ages, starting from 9 years old, all the way to 90. Men and women, and people of all different faiths and no faith. Jews, non-Jews, believers, non-believers, and different types. And around 200 people. It took me a while. But I asked the same question to all of them. If this question I just asked here, I posed here, which is, how much do you think, well, a little differently, I asked, how much do you know of yourself? Know thyself. How much percentage do you think you know yourself, really? And it could be 1%, it could be 100%. And across the board, without any difference in demographics, the only difference was age. Doesn't matter whether they're believers or non-believers, religious, not religious, Jewish or not, men or women. There was one difference. The younger the age, the higher the percentage. Basically, I remember 9-year-old, but they're definitely 10 and 11-year-olds. When you finally explain the question to them, which is also not so simple, but it's almost like 80, 90%. And a 15, 16-year-old, it goes down to 50, 60%. But in a few years, I'll know everything about myself. And as the age goes up, the percentage goes down. To the point that I'd asked at least 10 90-year-olds, and everyone said, I don't even know if it's 1%. So the interesting phenomenon here is that the older you get, with more experience, more knowledge, you'd think you'd get closer to your potential, and it's the exact opposite. Because the more you know, the more you know how little you know, basically. I don't know if this is an urban legend or not, but it's the debate rages on the internet that in 1898 the U.S. patent officer resigned with a statement that everything that could be discovered was discovered. Can you imagine? 1898. Okay, so he had the steam engine, he had electricity, he had the beginnings of cameras and TV and other things. But you didn't have yet Einstein, and definitely not quantum mechanics and computers and nuclear and atomic energy and everything we have today. No one in 1998 or now in 2011 would say that everything that could be invented has been invented. If you ask most people, or almost anybody today, tell me, how much you think we've gotten? We'd say we've barely scratched the surface. Because all that's discovered in the 20th century taught us that we have no clue. No one had a clue that there were subatomic particles 300-400 years ago. I mean, there may have been some fantasizers that fantasized such type of energy. And Kabbalah, mysticism, it definitely talks about it. But no one ever knew that it would be a scientific fact, and so on. So when you talk about psychologically, this human being, with all the medical breakthroughs, what do we know about our brain, which is the size of the palm of the hand? Very, very little. The greatest neurologists in the world will tell you we know very little about it. And what we know is tremendous amount. And it can has unbelievable developments and medicines and so on that are being discovered and developed as we speak, compared to what it was once. But how much more? Just a brain, the palm of the hand. How many ideas can your brain contain? We know hard drives have gigabytes, terabytes. What comes after terabytes? Zigabytes, whatever they are. That's my own. Sure, there's some name. So we know there's a hard drive, and at some point the hard drive will run out of memory. Well, how much does your brain hold? How much memory can your brain contain? How many ideas? 1 million? 100 million? I'm not talking about time-wise. Obviously, in a lifetime, there's only that many ideas you're going to be exposed to. But the capacity of the brain. Is there a place where it will say, that you've reached, you exceeded the memory? Well, one thing, we definitely haven't reached there. Jeff, maybe you have. I don't know. No? I'm like. So this is the small brain. And the capacity to love. How much can a person love? Is there like a point where you can't love any further? Again, take away the external reasons like fear or you don't want to love or whatever, you're selfish. Just the capacity. So, if nothing else, and this is an argument that I'm making here, forget about whether you can prove God's existence empirically or philosophically, but if nothing else, the idea of appreciating and relating to something that's beyond us, a reality beyond us, teaches you one critical message. It's called humility. That you have a very small perspective of the big picture. So if some people don't want to call it God, let them call it nature. You can call it the expanses of the cosmos. But the essential real meaning of God in Jewish thought is not about just some type of guy sitting on a throne in heaven with a long white beard, strikes us with lightning when we misbehave. Now that's a nursery school juvenile imagery. And the truth is that most people actually do have that image because that's what they picked up in school, in movies, in cartoons, in Woody Allen films, and so on. But the idea, the concept that there's a higher reality that's beyond our scope. And our perspective is a very small one. And when you climb the mountain and you see broader horizons, you realize how much more there is. What is the real ultimate message of that? The message is that you don't know very much about yourself. And not in a way of the word self-critique, or trying to feel low self-esteem. This is humility, which was, of course, the personality of Moses, is the greatest strength a human being has. The person who's able to say, I don't know. And not I don't know like a little child who doesn't know anything, so everything they don't know. But someone who knows a lot and comes to a door where they say, I'm not really sure, is the greatest people have that ability to be vulnerable like that. So faith, the way the Jewish mystics put faith, is like this. Faith is not absence of reason. As some people, like, I remember I was on a radio show and the guy asked me, so tell me, do you ever have a crisis of faith? That was like his cynical question. So I smiled and I said, yeah, every second of my life. And I said, you probably think that faith is like easy, right? Like if you don't believe in anything, life is challenging. Whereas faith is a crutch. What's the problem? You don't have an answer. You say it's God's fault. You have a problem, you turn to God. It's like a great crutch, which is what most people think of as faith. You don't want to rely on your own faculties and reason and tools, so you just pick up your hands and there's God. He says, yeah, it's exactly how I see it. So I said, so let me ask you something. If there's no God, and therefore there's no necessarily justice, and no design and no plan to the whole thing, then why does it bother you, for example, when you see children, defenseless children being massacred? Why should it bother you? Who says there's justice in the world? Survival of the fittest. Too bad. We live in a jungle. Just like you look at in the wild, predators, the most powerful ones will survive, and the weakest ones will die and be killed. It's sad to see. We don't like to see blood. We don't like to see anyone being hurt. But that's life. That's how it is. Why does it bother you? It should be very easy. A person of faith has to struggle every moment with this crisis. How does a good God allow for innocent people suffering? Why do bad things happen to good people? That can only be because possible, that dilemma, if you believe and want to believe that there's some justice or there's some higher good. If there's no higher good and it's complete anarchy, why does anything bother us? And I remember, and he was a real cynical guy, so I saw that he paused. He said, I have to think about that, So I understand he met people of faith, or a bunch of like juvenile faith, where faith is just this nice little crutch, and you just say God is I believe in God. But true faith is not a faculty which is absence of reason. The way I would put it is faith is beyond reason. Reason can lead you to a door that only faith can let you enter. When somebody dates someone and you fall in love with someone, and you really love them and you want to live the rest of your life with them, how do you finally make that decision? This is it. How can you be certain? There's nothing certain in this world. How do you know? What will happen a year from now, 5 years from now? We see people constantly talking about how much they love each other. 3 years later, they're in divorce court and they can't even look at each other. And they're not going to say they were delusional. You just see how fickle things are. So how do you make that certain decision? Absolutely, this person is for me. With reason? Reason can lead you to the door. You can analyze, you can review, you can test, someone to death. But at some point, if you're an honest person and you want to make a commitment does not come based on reason. Businessmen, the greatest ones, don't make that final decision purely on reason. They do their research and their homework, but at the end of the day, ask anyone who's made a major decision whether they're absolutely sure. They'll say, no, there was some risk. But my instincts, everything I know, plus my research and reason led me to this door, and then I had to jump in. And some people remain on the fence because they don't want to take the risk. And you know what happens? They never make the commitment, and they remain unsure. And like this guy I know, he's 75 years old, and he's still holding his options open. Let's put it that way. Fine. That's his choice. That's also a choice. It's like the pollster. I think I'm from the undecided. That's also a category today. Undecided. So good. The point I'm making here is that it's not about taking a leap, just leaping. It's about the process, by all means, but never think that the process itself is going to end with some reasonable decision. It's going to come from an emotional gut place that hopefully is informed by a serious discretion and analysis, and that you didn't just fall into something. But the ultimate move is an act of faith. I know a doctor, comes here once in a while to the class. He's a researcher. And he chose himself 2-3 diseases he's going to conquer in his lifetime. And he probably will. He's very ambitious and driven. But he considers himself an atheist. For some reason, he likes my class. I'm known to be the rabbi for certain atheists. They say, the God you talk about, I have no problem with. That's how he puts it to me. Okay, fine. That's fine with me. But he always tells me he doesn't believe in God, doesn't have faith and all that. I said, so tell me, how are you so convinced you're going to conquer this disease, these diseases? How do you know? Maybe some diseases are unconquerable. So nothing is unconquerable. He talks like a fanatic. Finally, I said to him, you're more fanatic than anyone I know. Except you don't call it God, you call it conquering health. That everything can be conquered. It's the infatigable human spirit that does not take no for an answer. And it's the same thing that mothers who commit to their autistic or other children that doctors give up on. And there's something about the spirit that uncovers things. Someone came to you for an investment for $100 100 years ago. And for what is the $100? I want to create an object that's going to fly in the sky, like a bird. You throw them out of your house. Shugana that we say in Yiddish, right? Guy wants to fly. He sees birds, they want to fly. People want to fly. And now every time I take off on a plane, I think to myself, which crackpot decided to commit himself that he's going to fly? And they actually built these massive pieces of metal, and they figured out how it flies. Now we have airports that themselves are an industry of their own, and security lines that are endless, all based on some Meshugana, exactly, that decided he's going to fly. So to say that something is impossible, we take it for granted. Fine. But all it was really human beings looking up in the sky. They wanted to go into the sky. They see birds are flying. Why can't we fly? Fine. So we didn't become birds, but we created metal birds, whatever you want to call it. And the truth is, all technology really is copying, emulating nature. Cameras like the eye. Everything is copying something we see, we aspire to. Billions of dollars just to go to outer space for what? To satisfy curiosity. That's what it comes down to. Yes, many industries have grown out of it, have been spawned out of NASA's exploration. We have all these type of walking shoes, and I think Velcro. I mean, the list goes on. All kinds of technologies have been developed as a side effect. But that's not why they went to outer space. They went to outer space to see what's going on up there. We want to know whether there's life or what's on the moon. And it fascinates us to no end. I'm not dismissing it. It just shows us what human beings are capable of when you set your mind to it. So no one should ever think, and this is where Moses was a Moses. He was a first. Today, for someone to come and invent a new thing, we already saw in history people who set their mind to fly. They set their mind to conquer diseases. We set our minds to develop all kinds of new technologies. And we succeeded. So today it doesn't take a pioneer, because we've seen pioneers who were told that it's impossible, and it happened. But who were the first pioneers? You want to study them? Read Abraham in the Bible. Read Moses. Here's this man Moses, is maybe the greatest of all pioneers. And in the stories that we read continuously about him, you see a person who confronted real challenges. Pharaoh was the symbol of evil, symbol of difficult, of challenge. Now there's mystical meanings in Pharaoh and psychological ones. I'm not talking about Pharaoh per se, only the human being. And the interesting thing is he acknowledged that he was afraid. That you'd think a pioneer, a great man, who till this day we still talk about Moses and his stories, and the Bible probably is still the biggest bestseller. Literally, the biggest bestseller. The New York Times doesn't even record it. It sells more Bibles a year than all the bestsellers combined. Till this day. In the so-called age of reason and enlightenment and all that. So, this Moses, the man of great courage, the man that took on anything, any challenge, was able to say in this chapter, I'm afraid. Because that's what strong people are able to do. Now his fear was not fear coming out of weakness, it was fear of recognizing what he's facing and recognizing there's something bigger here. It was humility. And because he had that, God said to him, I will show you now strengths inside of you. I will come with you and show you strengths inside of you that you can overcome your fear. It wasn't just that God was going to deal with all the problems. Like I said, Moses could have said to God, you know what, I'm afraid. You go to Pharaoh. What do you need me? That wasn't the case. He went, but he didn't go alone. So when we talk about those inner strengths that we have, even this doctor I mentioned who calls himself an atheist, I don't care what he wants to call it, but where does he get that inner conviction that he can absolutely conquer a disease? It doesn't come from just a mortal idea, because mortals, nothing there's always impossible. We can't, for example, jump 1,000 feet up into the air. We can build a plane. We can build ladders. But there's certain things we have our limits. We need to eat, to sleep, to drink. But there's something in the spirit that each of us has that is absolutely indefatigable, absolutely unconquerable. And some of us access it. Some of us access it in times of danger and challenge. Some of us access it out of ambition. But the key antidote to fear is knowing that you have an equal force that is just as powerful, and if not more powerful. But you can't just access it because you're going gung-ho and you're so confident in yourself. You access it through humility, to realizing that I can't do it alone, that there are parts of me that I do not understand, there are parts of me that are very fearful, and not afraid to go to a place of fear. And then, if you want to call it miraculously, it's not miraculous, another force emerges that gives you the strength to deal with it. There's a story, and I can elaborate on this more, but we do have limited time. There's a story that I've told many times. It's just very inspiring to me. It happened in 1927. So this was in Russia, right in the new Soviet Union, right after the revolution. And as you all know, when the Tsar was overthrown, and then the Russian Revolution and the World War I, the Bolsheviks. So what came was, even though it was difficult for Jews to live under the Tsar, the communists were far more challenging, because they basically abolished all religion, especially Judaism, all formal type of practice. Religion, opiate of the masses, Marx wrote. And they saw that as antithetical to the loyalty of the people to the communist revolution. Well, you're talking about, some say 10 million Jews at the time in Russia. No one really even knows. It wasn't a small matter. It was like not some little country. It happened to be the largest bulk of the Jewish population. And there were all kinds of debates what to do. Many saw the time had come that Jews have to leave, but they couldn't all leave suddenly. Well, there was one Rebbe, to make a long story short, who decided that he is not, next week is his yahrzeit, his 70th yahrzeit, I believe, 71st, 61st. So he decided that he's going to remain as long as he can, but he's going to go to war with this great Soviet regime, which was insanity, frankly, from any natural point of view. How could you go to war? Didn't have resources, an army. But in spirit, he was not going to cooperate, and he created this whole elaborate underground network. The schools were shut down, the synagogues were shut down, circumcision, slaughtering of meat, kosher, the whole works. Basically all, I don't want to even mention the comparison, but imagine the United States suddenly passed a law that all Jewish practice is forbidden in this country. Every possible level. The radical impact that it would have. So he created this whole secret underground that, interestingly, had effect even on President Putin, whatever he's called today. He's the prime minister. But the bottom line is, he was arrested, and then there was no big thing. There was no due process. They could shoot and kill anybody without any big thing. There was all these fake trials anyway. And he was arrested, and he writes in his diary, which he calls, just for your information, he calls it the Tractate from Hell, Masechta Gehenim, because they tortured him. It was a difficult time for him there. And he writes how he made a decision in his heart that he would not cooperate, no way with them. He'd rather die than cooperate, because it was a certain type of conviction, pride. And even though he spoke fluent Russian, he chose to speak only Yiddish. Now, mind you, his captors were Jewish, because this was the Jewish department it was called the Yevsektsy, the Jewish communists, who were more anti-Jewish than the non-Jews were, as you can imagine, because they saw religion as being an enemy. And they fought it with passion. So one of the times when he refused to cooperate, one of these Jews, who happened to have a grandfather that was once a chassid of this Rebbe's grandfather, pointed a gun to the Rebbe's head and said to him, "Listen, Rebbe," in Yiddish he said to him, "it's time to cooperate. And this object here, this gun, this pistol, has made many people cooperate." And the Rebbe responded to him and said, "This toy can frighten someone that has one world and many gods, but not someone that has one God and many worlds." Well, the end of the story is that they end up shooting the other guy, and the Rebbe ended up miraculously being freed, which is a whole story of its own, ultimately leaving Russia and coming to the United States in 1940. But the story, what he answered to him, it can't frighten someone that has one world and many gods. No, I'm sorry, there's one God and many worlds. Only one person, a person who has one world and many gods. This was not a cliche. He was with a loaded gun to his head. And he was not saying it for show because there was no one there to record it, to photograph it. There was no National Geographic watching it. So it wasn't exactly for drama purposes. And he could have been shot right there for that. But this is the strength of faith. What he was saying was not that he embraces death, but you can't frighten me, because fear comes from feeling that something's going to be taken away from you. So if you put all your eggs in one basket, what of course will happen is if it's all taken away, you have nothing left. I remember I was invited to speak in, what is it called, Canary Wharf in London, the morning after, which firm had closed down the, not Reichman, the Lehman Brothers, The Lehman Brothers firm. Now, the scheduled talk was scheduled 3-4 months earlier, and the talk was how to survive through economic recession or something. So it was interesting that morning was when Monday morning when the announcement came that Lehman Brothers closed down, and they had a big branch there in Canary Wharf in London. So lunch was supposed to be my talk. Instead of having the usual 40-50 people, I had like 300 people, because they were all laid off. They had nothing else to do. And the topic sounded interesting. So I told them the lesson is this: diversify, diversify, diversify. I was giving them financial advice. And what was the advice? But what is the diversification? Not just whether you should put it in bonds or in stocks or in mutual funds or whatever, or treasuries, but diversification means don't put it all in finance. If you put all your life in money, then when the money wanes, your life will wane with it. If your self-worth is defined by your net worth, then you will be fluctuating as the stock market does. And that's not very healthy these days, and any day for that matter. Whereas if you diversify and you have other things in life that give you security, not just securities, quote unquote, that don't give security, and you really have other things in your life, then even if one world is taken, or somewhat minimized, diminished, there's other worlds that you can rely on. And that's what the Rebbe was saying. He says, one God and many worlds. Yes, you could take away my material world, but I have my children, and there's a future. And look what happened with the Jewish faith. 6 million Jews were massacred, but their children survived and built and created a renaissance. You cannot destroy something that is ethereal. You can only destroy the material. And people of faith always knew that. That's why you cannot destroy faith. You cannot destroy it because it's not, just like you can only destroy something that you give birth to. You can't kill something that was never born. The spirit was not born, therefore it cannot die. The soul was not born, it cannot die. The body is born and dies, and so is everything else in this material world. So this requires obviously a reframing and a refocus of what is a priority, what's not. Obviously a person who's able to connect to the spirit in that way has a whole different level of fearlessness and courage. But you see, Moses, a great man of faith, the greatest of all people of faith, again, had no problem acknowledging when he was afraid, because he was facing now a world that was very cruel and an evil that he had not faced before. But that opened up the resources that allowed him to prevail. So, to sum up, let me just say this. We have many, many unconscious fears, most you'll never see in your life. You'll see their impact on your life. And many times you don't even know that it's impacting you. But you also have unbelievable strengths that you're also not aware of. But they're accessible. And they are accessible when a person is able to acknowledge that I don't have it all figured out. that yes, that it's not, I'm not just going to blame everyone else for my problems. That if I want to find a relationship and love in my life, I have to be able to say, maybe I have some deep fears I'm not aware of. And not just try to lay another layer of armor, another defense mechanism, because, yeah, you may be able to protect yourself, but you're not going to get what you want in your life. And you'll end up being maybe not hurt, because you've now become vulnerable, but no one can enter then as well. Because it goes two ways. You're not going to find someone vulnerable who's going to be vulnerable with you if you're not going to be vulnerable with them. Intimacy takes two to tango. It requires an opening, and that requires strength and courage, but also requires understanding and sense and humility, acknowledging that we have fears when it comes to that. Everyone does. We all have fears when it comes to issues of trust. Can we really trust? Should I really open up? Some of us have developed sophisticated mechanisms where everybody thinks you're open, when the truth is you're not open, but meanwhile everybody's opening to you. And I'm sure some of you have developed that too. It's very good, it's excellent. You sound vulnerable, but it's all premeditated and all figured out. It's like a planned vulnerability, planned spontaneity, whatever you want to call it. So, bottom line is, yeah, you may maneuver well, and you may have good mind games and know how to play chess well, but do you really find love in your life? Do you find happiness? Because remember, then a part of you remains locked in your fortress and forever. And really, it's fear that is creating all these defense mechanisms. The strongest people of all are the people who have no problem celebrating their vulnerability. So, this is a theme that I see surely requires much more discussion. I will touch upon it in the next coming weeks. But I want to just conclude by saying that even though it's a blessing, but it's going to take some work on your part, follow Moses' path. And we all have a little Moses inside of us, they say, which means there's nothing wrong at times where you can say, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm afraid. And also it doesn't hurt to cry once in a while. And obviously to do so with people or with a person you can trust. I'm not just saying wearing it on your sleeve and going out and just opening yourself up completely. That joke about this Jew who's ends up in a church, goes to the priest and he's starting to confess his sins. And the priest is very impressed and says, my son, how did you finally come to the truth and discover that here's the place to confess? He says, first of all, I'm not your son. And second of all, don't take it personally. I'm telling everybody. Okay? I'm not talking about going the other extreme where you just completely let it out. But it's about the possibility that you can open to someone. The possibility that you could. I'm not talking about confession now. That was not my intention. That you could open up and let it grow. And when you do that, then something comes to you. God comes to you. And the new resources open up. And here's the proof in the pudding. Who prevailed? Pharaoh is gone off the map. We don't know who his children and his grandchildren are. And Moses prevailed. And we know exactly who his grandchildren are and who his people are. So, you see a story that there was a success at the end of it. So, I wish all of us to find success, not thousands of years later, but in our lifetimes. And please see me as a friend, and hope I could see you as a friend as well, and we can help each other. Finding the right person you could trust to talk about sometimes things that are very vulnerable. No problem with shopping around. Find somebody you really can trust. But it's a key thing to be able to open that up, because once you do, other doors open up that are absolutely immensely, infinitely powerful. So it's vulnerability that can bring you to the ultimate invulnerability. May God bless you all to discover that. So thank you everyone very much. And I hope some fears will melt away on their own, and the rest we'll work on. And tomorrow night, Philip is giving his class at 7 p.m. Those that come, you can challenge him as well. He'll talk to you about fear. He knows a few things about it. And we will continue. Next Wednesday night, I'll be at class here as well. And finally, please, if you haven't given us your email address, please leave that, and we will stay in touch. And can I say, it's an honor to journey this life with all of you and to know you consciously and unconsciously. Be well. Have a good night.